They mocked the two veterans for the strange fortress they were building into the Idaho hillside, calling it a waste, a monument to paranoia born from a war far away. Mike Carter and Dave Chen, former Navy SEALs who had come to Pine Hollow seeking quiet, just kept working, their loyal German shepherd, Shadow, always nearby. But one afternoon, the dog began to dig at a frozen patch of ground, refusing to leave the spot as if it sensed something hidden deep within the earth. And when the worst blizzard in a century descended, the one the town never saw coming, the place they all laughed at became the only thing keeping every last one of them alive. What the dog uncovered that day changed everything, and what the two men knew before anyone else would become the valley's salvation. The place had a name among the locals: Carter's Folly. From the valley floor, it looked like little more than a low-slung cabin of thick, hand-hewn timbers and native stone, hunkered into the south-facing slope of Buckhorn Ridge. It seemed too solid, too deliberate for a simple mountain retreat. The windows were triple-paned and recessed deep into the walls. The metal roof was pitched at a steep angle, designed to shed snow load with ruthless efficiency. What they couldn't see was the heart of the structure, the part that earned the mockery. 2/3 of the living space was subterranean, excavated directly from the granite of the ridge itself. Mike Carter, a man of 49 with quiet hands and eyes that held the permanent watchfulness of his former life, had designed it all with his teammate Dave Chen. Dave, younger but carrying the same weight in his shoulders, was the engineer, the master of systems. Together, they were a unit of two, moving with the shared, unspoken language of men who had trusted their lives to one another in the harshest landscapes on Earth. Their dog, Shadow, a magnificent black and sable shepherd, was more than a pet. He was their perimeter, their early warning system, a silent third member of their team. He moved where Mike moved, a constant, grounding presence. The warmth in their home didn't come from a propane furnace that could fail or run empty. It radiated up from the very ground they walked on. Dave had spent a year laying a geothermal loop, hundreds of feet of tubing buried in deep trenches, circulating a water glycol mixture that drew the constant, stable 55-degree temperature from the earth and used a small, efficient heat pump to warm the polished concrete floors. It was a slow, patient, and unbreakable warmth. Their water came from a series of 3 interconnected 1,000-gallon cisterns buried uphill from the cabin, fed by snowmelt and a seasonal creek, filtered through sand and charcoal into a gravity-fed system that needed no electricity to run. For light and power, they had a modest solar array, but their true innovation was a wood gasifier Dave had built from salvaged steel drums and copper tubing. It could turn seasoned pine into clean-burning syngas, capable of running a small generator for hours on a handful of wood, powering the low-wattage LED strips that illuminated their home and the small, vital hydroponic garden they maintained in one of the underground rooms. Here, under the warm glow of grow lamps, they cultivated lettuce, kale, tomatoes, and herbs, a splash of impossible green life deep in the mountain's heart. They were not building a bunker for the end of the world. They were building a sanctuary against the one enemy they knew could not be reasoned with or fought: the cold. In the main living area, a simple shelf held a few dozen books, a small satellite radio, and a single heavy steel footlocker that had belonged to Mike's father. It was locked, and he had never spoken of what was inside, treating it with a kind of distant reverence, a piece of his past he wasn't yet ready to face. A trip into Pine Hollow was a necessary task, undertaken no more than once a month for the few supplies they couldn't produce themselves: salt, coffee, flour, machine oil, and ammunition. The town was a small cluster of buildings in a narrow valley, a place that felt a decade or two behind the rest of the world. Their first stop was always Sarah's Mercantile, a long, narrow building that smelled of floor polish, burlap, and spices. Sarah Gable, a widow in her late 50s with kind eyes and a practical set of hands, ran the place alone. She never joined in the town's gentle ribbing of the two veterans. She'd known loss herself, her husband taken by a logging accident years ago, and she seemed to recognize something familiar in their quiet reserve. "Hard winter coming, boys," she'd say, her voice soft as she weighed out their flour. "The old-timers feel it in their bones." She would always add an extra box of matches or a small bag of hard candy to their order, a small, unspoken gesture of solidarity. "Just in case," she'd murmur, and they would nod their thanks. Their other stop was the gas station, and it was there the mockery usually found them. The unofficial heart of the town's gossip was the Rusty Spur, the tavern next door, and its owner, Hank Miller, a burly man with a perpetually flushed face and a voice that carried across the street. Hank wasn't a cruel man, but he was loud and certain in his opinions. He'd see their truck and wander over, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "Still building that doomsday palace up on the hill, boys?" He'd boom, a smirk playing on his lips. A few of the other men, loafers and ranchers nursing morning beers, would chuckle along. "Heard you got tunnels under there. Planning for the apocalypse?" Mike would just continue filling the gas cans, his expression unreadable. Dave might offer a tight, small smile, but never a reply. They didn't defend themselves. There was no point. The language they spoke, of preparation, of redundancy, of acknowledging how quickly the thin veneer of comfort could be stripped away, was a foreign one in a town that had always been bailed out by the county plow or a generator truck from the power company. They were an oddity, two men who had seen the world's harsh edges and refused to forget them. They'd load their supplies, pay in cash, and drive away, leaving the laughter and the shaking heads behind them. As they drove back up the winding dirt road to their ridge, the valley falling away below, Dave once broke the silence. "You ever get tired of it?" Mike watched the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "They don't know," he said, and it was explanation enough. They weren't building for them. They were building for the memory of what happened when you weren't ready. Back in the cabin, the warmth would greet them, the quiet hum of the systems a welcome contrast to the noise of the town. Mike would sometimes glance at the steel footlocker on the shelf, his father's legacy, a silent testament to a different kind of preparation from a different generation, its contents still a mystery he carried with him. The reason they prepared with such monastic devotion was buried deep in the snows of the Hindu Kush. They had been part of an 8-man team, inserted on a high-altitude ridge to perform reconnaissance. They were the best, trained for any contingency, but they hadn't trained for the sky to fall on them without warning. A freak storm, a whiteout of impossible ferocity, had descended in minutes. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. Their gear, the best in the world, began to fail. Communications went dead. One of their own, a young corpsman named Miller, had gotten separated from the group, lost in the blinding chaos. They found him the next morning, frozen solid, less than 100 yards from their makeshift shelter. He had died alone, in the unforgiving cold, because of a moment's disorientation. Mike and Dave had carried his body for 2 days, back to the extraction point. The weight of it, the profound, silent failure of it, had settled into their bones. They left the service a year later, haunted not by combat, but by the quiet, indifferent lethality of the cold. They had come to Idaho to build a place where the cold could never win, a fortress not against men, but against the memory of that failure. It was this unspoken history that made them trust the dog's instincts without question. One afternoon in late October, with the ground already hard as iron, Shadow began to act strangely. He became fixated on a section of the hillside about 50 yards behind the cabin, a place where the granite face was interrupted by a jumble of smaller rocks and frozen soil. He started digging, his powerful paws scraping at the earth with a single-minded intensity they had never seen before. He ignored their calls, whining with low frustration, digging until his paws were raw. "What is it, boy?" Mike said, kneeling beside him. There was nothing there, just rock and dirt. But Shadow would not be deterred. For 2 days, he returned to the same spot, his obsession unwavering. On the 3rd day, Dave brought out a pickaxe and a shovel. "The dog's onto something," he said, his voice flat with certainty. "Might as well see what it is." They dug for hours, the rhythmic chunk of the pickaxe echoing in the cold, thin air. Just before dusk, the axe head punched through something with a hollow thud. They cleared away the dirt and rock and found it. A heavy wooden door, its timbers grayed with age and reinforced with rusted iron straps. It was a door that had been deliberately buried. Using a crowbar, they pried it open. A wave of cool, still air, smelling of earth and dust, washed over them. They shone their flashlights into the darkness and saw a narrow tunnel, shored up with thick beams, disappearing into the heart of the mountain. It was an old prospecting shaft, long forgotten. Cautiously, they entered. About 30 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small man-made cavern. Stacked against one wall were dozens of sealed military surplus ammunition cans. Against the other were wooden crates. Inside, they found a treasure trove, canned goods from the 1960s, medical supplies, tools, kerosene lanterns, and bags of desiccated food. On top of one of the crates sat a metal box. Inside, sealed in a glass jar, was a letter. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was dated 1962. "If you are reading this," it began, "then the world I feared did not come to pass, but perhaps another trial has found you. My name is Elias Vance. I built this place as a shelter for my family during the missile crisis. The tunnel follows a fault line, and at its end, you will find what I was truly looking for, a deep, artesian spring that flows year-round from the mountain's heart, untouched by the seasons. It never freezes. Use this place well. Look after your neighbors. God be with you." Mike and Dave stood in the silent underground room, the beam of their flashlights illuminating the legacy of a man who had prepared for a different kind of storm. They had built their fortress on top of another, older one. And now, they had access to its most vital secret, a source of water that could not be taken from them. The discovery of the spring changed the calculus of their preparations. It was a force multiplier, a gift from a ghost. They now had a resource that made them truly self-sufficient. As November settled over the valley, Mike and Dave began to notice the small, quiet signs the town below ignored. They were men trained to read environments, to see the subtle shifts that heralded a larger event. The first sign was the birds. Flocks of pine siskins and redpolls, birds that usually stayed in the higher elevations until the deepest part of winter, descended into the valley weeks ahead of schedule, their chattering a nervous, frantic energy in the bare aspen groves. The squirrels, too, were different. They weren't just gathering nuts. They were stripping entire branches of pine cones with a desperate, obsessive fury, their caches overflowing. It was a primal fear they were responding to. The sky itself felt different. The air was often heavy, still, carrying a strange metallic tang. The pressure shifts on Mike's old brass barometer were more frequent and more dramatic than any he had ever recorded. The needle would swing wildly, a silent harbinger of atmospheric instability. One afternoon, a retired forest ranger named Al, who lived in a small cabin on the far side of the ridge, stopped by on his way to check his traps. He was a leathery old man who had spent 60 years in these mountains. He accepted a cup of coffee, but didn't come inside, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. "Something's coming, boys," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Haven't felt air like this since the winter of '89. That one buried this valley for 3 weeks, took out the power lines clean down to the substation." He took a sip of coffee, his gaze distant. "You two are smart, building into the hill like this. Most folks down there think their furnace and a full tank of propane is all they'll ever need." He handed the mug back to Dave. Keep an eye on that sky. She ain't fooling around this year. His words confirmed their own unease. They intensified their work with a quiet, focused urgency. They spent a week running a new, heavily insulated PEX pipe from the hidden spring in Elias Vance's tunnel directly into their main cistern, bypassing the seasonal creek entirely. They now had a direct underground feed of liquid water, immune to the surface freeze. They climbed onto the roof and added a second layer of steel hurricane clips to the trusses, reinforcing the structure against extreme wind and snow load. They cut and split another 2 cords of firewood, stacking it in the sheltered woodshed until it was overflowing. They tested the wood gasifier again, running it for 12 straight hours to ensure its stability. Inside the cabin, they consolidated the supplies from the tunnel, taking careful inventory, organizing the decades-old cans and medical kits. Shadow seemed to sense the shift in their energy, the building tension. He grew restless, pacing the perimeter of the property, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind, his low growls in the night directed at the oppressive, waiting silence of the forest. They were no longer just preparing against a memory. They were preparing for a certainty. The mountain was speaking to them, and they were listening. The first flakes began to fall just after noon on a Tuesday. They were large and wet, clinging to the pine needles and melting on the dark earth. By dusk, the snowfall had intensified, the flakes growing smaller and harder, driven by a rising wind that moaned through the lodgepole pines. By nightfall, it was a full-blown blizzard. This was not a normal mountain storm. This was something different, something elemental and furious. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed, a solid wall of sound and motion that shook the triple-paned windows in their frames. The snow was no longer falling but moving horizontally, a blinding, scouring whiteness that erased the world. Inside their cabin, the silence was profound. The earth and rock surrounding them absorbed the storm's rage, leaving only the quiet hum of their systems and the gentle crackle of the fire in the wood stove. The geothermal heat radiated from the floor, a constant, reassuring warmth. Shadow lay stretched out on the rug, his head on his paws, utterly calm now that the waiting was over. Mike and Dave moved through their evening routine, the storm outside a distant, abstract threat. Down in Pine Hollow, it was chaos. The power went out at 7:42 p.m., the moment a massive gust of wind snapped a line of power poles like matchsticks. The town was plunged into an immediate and absolute darkness, broken only by the swirling chaos of the snow. Backup generators sputtered to life, and then fell silent as fuel lines froze or intakes became clogged with snow. Houses built to modern code, reliant on forced air furnaces, grew cold with alarming speed. The steady, relentless wind found every crack, every seam, leaching the warmth away. Pipes in crawl spaces and exterior walls began to freeze. The town's single snowplow made one futile pass down Main Street before the driver was forced to abandon it, the snow accumulating faster than he could possibly clear it. The roads were gone, buried under a shifting, growing ocean of white. The town was cut off, an island of flickering candles and growing fear in the face of the storm's overwhelming power. Hank Miller, in his tavern, tried to keep spirits up, pouring free whiskeys by the light of a kerosene lantern. But as the temperature inside the old, poorly insulated building continued to drop, the forced cheer evaporated, replaced by a grim, shivering reality. Sarah Gable, in her apartment above the Mercantile, lit a fire in her small wood stove, the one she rarely used, and listened as the wind tore at the roof of the old building, praying it would hold. The blizzard did not relent. It hammered the valley for a full day, and then another. The snow was measured not in inches, but in feet. Drifts piled up against doors and windows, burying cars and reaching the eaves of single-story homes. The world shrank to the confines of 4 cold walls. The steady trickle of comfort and convenience that defined modern life had been severed, and the people of Pine Hollow were left with a terrifyingly simple equation: the cold, and whatever they had on hand to fight it. Up on the ridge, Mike and Dave watched the snow pile up against their windows. They went outside in shifts, dressed in their old military-grade cold weather gear, to keep the chimney and ventilation ducts clear. The work was brutal, but their fortress held. It was exactly what they had built it for, an anchor of warmth and stability in a world that had come undone. The first knock on their door came on the third day of the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Shadow heard it first, his head lifting from the floor with a low woof. Mike opened the heavy timber door to a wall of swirling snow. A figure, covered head to toe in white, stumbled forward and nearly collapsed into the room. It was Sarah Gable. Her face was pale with exhaustion and cold, ice clinging to her eyelashes. "My stovepipe," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "It clogged with snow, filled the whole place with smoke. I had nowhere else to go." They brought her in, sat her by the fire, and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. Dave handed her a hot mug of coffee, his movements calm and efficient. She looked around the warm, well-lit room, at the green plants growing under the lights in the corner, and her eyes filled with tears. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew you boys were smart." She had made the 1.5-mile journey on snowshoes, a desperate trek that had taken her 3 hours. Later that day, a voice crackled over the small battery-powered walkie-talkie they kept on the shelf. It was Hank Miller. His voice was strained, stripped of all its usual bluster. "Carter, you there? It's Hank. The roof on the tavern. It's starting to give. We've got kids here. We're freezing." Mike picked up the radio. "How many of you, Tsatina?" he asked. "8 of us. My family and the Hendersons from next door." There was a pause, and then Hank's voice came back, thick with a humility Mike had never heard. "We were wrong about you, man. We were fools. Can you help us?" "Stay put," Mike said. "We're coming for you." Getting down to the town was a grueling, dangerous task. They used an old rescue sled, the kind designed for mountain evacuations, taking turns breaking a trail through the chest-deep snow. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach the tavern. They found the small group huddled together under a pile of blankets, their faces pinched and blue in the lantern light. The main beam of the roof was visibly sagging under the immense weight of the snow. Hank looked at Mike, his eyes full of shame and gratitude, and simply nodded. He couldn't find the words. They loaded the children and Hank's wife onto the sled and began the slow, arduous journey back up the hill, Hank and the other man helping to push. The cabin, once a private sanctuary, became a refuge. They brought the newcomers into the warmth, gave them hot soup and a place on the floor. News of the shelter on the ridge spread through the few remaining walkie-talkies in the valley. The next day, more came. The Davison family, whose propane tank had run empty. Old Man Hemlock, whose chimney had collapsed. A slow, desperate pilgrimage of shivering souls made their way up the trail Mike and Dave had broken. The very people who had laughed at their folly now seeking its salvation. They took them all in, their space growing crowded, but their systems holding steady. The geothermal loop kept the floor warm. The spring provided endless water. The wood gasifier hummed, providing the power they needed. The place they had built to quiet their own ghosts was now sheltering their entire community. For 9 days, the storm held the valley in its frozen grip. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by the constant, shrieking white of the blizzard. Inside, a new kind of community began to form, forged by shared hardship and the quiet, steady competence of their hosts. Mike and Dave organized the shelter with the same calm efficiency they applied to everything. The days fell into a routine. The men were organized into work crews, their primary task to keep the roof, chimney, and ventilation intakes clear of the relentlessly accumulating snow. It was back-breaking work in brutal conditions, but it was necessary for survival, and no one complained. The women took over the kitchen, preparing simple, hearty meals from the deep stores of food Mike and Dave had laid in, supplemented by the supplies from Elias Vance's hidden cache. They cared for the children, organizing games and reading stories to keep their fear at bay. The crowded space, which could have descended into tension and chaos, instead became a hum of purposeful activity. People who had been little more than passing acquaintances in town were now partners in a shared struggle. They learned to rely on each other, to share what little they had. The mockery that had once defined the town's relationship with the two veterans was replaced by a deep and profound respect. The change was most evident in Hank Miller. Stripped of his bar owner bravado, he became quiet and observant. He watched how Mike and Dave moved, how they checked the systems, how they anticipated problems before they arose. On the fifth day, Hank found Mike in the small utility room, checking the gauges on the water filtration system. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Mike," he said, his voice low, "I need to say it plain. I was a fool. I ran my mouth about you in this place for a year. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." Mike didn't stop his work, just nodded. "We all make mistakes, Hank." "No," Hank insisted, stepping into the room. "This is more than that. You didn't just save my family. You saved all of us. This place, it's a miracle." Mike finally turned, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the man who had been his chief tormentor. "It's not a miracle, Hank," he said, his voice even. "It's just work. It's seeing what's coming and doing the work." The simple, direct honesty of the statement landed with more force than any rebuke. From that day on, Hank became Mike's shadow, learning the systems, helping with repairs, his apology made not in words, but in quiet, dedicated labor. Shadow, the dog, moved through it all like a gentle guardian, allowing the children to bury their hands in his thick fur, resting his heavy head on the laps of the elderly, a warm and reassuring presence in the heart of the storm. The fortress built by two haunted men had become a living ark, holding the heart of Pine Hollow safe until the storm passed. When the sky finally cleared on the 10th morning, the world was remade in white and blue. The silence was absolute, the sun glinting off a landscape buried under more than 10 feet of snow. It was another 2 days before the first state plows and rescue crews broke through to the valley. They found a scene of devastation, collapsed roofs, buried vehicles, and homes rendered uninhabitable by burst pipes and freezing temperatures. But as they went house to house, they discovered something incredible. The houses were empty. The town, they soon learned, was alive and well, sheltered together in the fortified cabin on Buckhorn Ridge. The story of Carter's Folly became the stuff of local legend, a tale of foresight and quiet heroism told and retold throughout the state. That spring, the town of Pine Hollow was different. The shared experience in the shelter had burned away old grudges and petty divisions. Led by a deeply changed Hank Miller, they formed a town council for the first time in 30 years, its sole purpose to create a community preparedness plan. They didn't hire outside consultants. They went up the hill and asked Mike and Dave. Under their guidance, the townspeople worked together to reinforce the community hall, insulating it and installing a massive wood stove. They invested in a communal generator and helped their neighbors winterize their homes, not with government grants, but with shared labor and know-how. Hank organized a team to develop the spring Elias Vance had discovered, building a small, insulated well house around it, ensuring the entire town would have access to a water source that would never freeze. The work of two men became the work of a whole community. Years passed. The valley healed. Mike and Dave remained on their ridge, no longer outsiders but respected elders, the quiet guardians of the town's memory. Shadow grew old, his muzzle turning a soft, distinguished gray. He spent his days sleeping in patches of sun on the warm concrete floor, his duty done. One evening, as a gentle autumn rain fell outside, Mike finally took the old steel footlocker down from the shelf. He had carried it with him for years, a final piece of his father he hadn't been ready to confront. He found the key on his dog tags and opened it. It didn't contain survival gear or valuables. It was filled with old photographs and letters. They were from his grandfather, a man who had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. He wrote to his son about the lean years, about the importance of foresight, of community, of being the man who had a little extra to share when a neighbor's luck ran out. Preparation is not about saving yourself, one letter read. It's about being ready to save your people. Mike sat there, reading the words of a man he'd never met, and understood that the foundations of his fortress had been laid long before he was ever born, a legacy of quiet duty passed down through generations. He had finally, truly, come home. There is a quiet strength in the world that often goes unnoticed, a gentle power in those who prepare not out of fear for themselves, but out of a deep and abiding sense of duty to others. Mike Carter and Dave Chen were such men. They carried the weight of a past loss, and instead of letting it break them, they forged it into a shield for a community that didn't even know it needed one. The world has a way of laughing at those who are different, at those who see a storm on the horizon, while others see only clear skies. It calls them paranoid, foolish, strange. Yet so often, these are the very people placed in our lives as guardians in waiting, the quiet sentinels whose foresight becomes our salvation. Their work is not done for applause or recognition, but for the simple, profound purpose of being ready when the cold comes. It is a testament to the idea that the deepest forms of love and service are often the most practical. A warm floor, a full cistern, a roof that holds against the storm. It makes one wonder, who are the quiet preparers in our own lives? Who are the steady hands building a refuge we may one day need? Perhaps their work is a reminder to us all to look after our neighbors, to listen to the wisdom of those who have seen the storm before, and to have faith that even in the longest, coldest winter, there is always a hearth to be found, built by those who cared enough to do the work. May we all find such shelter when we need it, and may we have the wisdom to build it for others when we can.